Hello and welcome to this video. So today I want to look at preparing your digital file for printing. So the specific type of printing I'm going to be looking at is preparing for inkjet printing, which is high-end printing. Now this could be printing at home, or if you're sending it to a printer. So when I talk about sending it to a printer, most professional printers will use inkjet printers these days. There are a few printers that also have Lambda printers, which is a kind of a digital darkroom type printer. But mostly I think printers these days, at least the ones that I'm aware of, are using inkjet. I myself have worked for Digital Print Lab using inkjet printers, printing for fine art exhibitions, photography specifically, for about 12 years. So I have a good bit of experience in what needs to be done to prepare your file in order to optimize it and get the best out of it. So if you're interested in learning that, if you're preparing files for an exhibition or something else to get them printed, then I'll go through steps to optimize it here. So I'm starting here first of all with a raw image that's open in Adobe Camera Raw. Below here, so at the bottom you see here where I have my settings. So my settings for when I open it in Photoshop as a digital image, because at the moment it's just raw data. In your workflow, you will have your color space, which I normally set to ProPhoto RGB. That is the biggest color space available. So I normally use that when editing with a bit depth of 16 bits. So this is what Adobe recommend is in their best practices, that you do your editing at 16 bits per channel when you're editing from a RAW file. If you're editing from a JPEG file, it's not so important, because JPEG files will be 8 bits per channel. So it just means that there's less tonal information, less data inside the digital file. So you won't have as much, let's say, wiggle room for doing your editing. Whereas in 16-bit mode, you'll have much more. It will retain all the tonal information that was in the RAW file when you shot it. Most RAW files are either 12 or 14-bit, but we edited it in 16-bit per channel because it's only a choice between 8 and 16-bit. And then I'm leaving my image sizing at default, and I don't sharpen the image now. Sharpening is normally the very last thing you do right before printing. So I click on OK there just to accept those settings, and then I'm going to click on Open, and it will use these settings when I open the image in Photoshop. So the image will open in Photoshop. Yeah, so I'm not going to go into much detail about editing this particular image, but rather talk in general terms about editing and preparing for printing. So as I mentioned, if I go to Edit and Convert to Profile, you see currently this file is in ProPhoto. So that's the space we want it in. So I'm just going to click Cancel here. And we'll also notice if I go to Image Mode that we're in 16-bit per channel mode. So the things that you want to be aware of is when you're editing or preparing your images, if you're preparing them on a monitor at home, the first thing you need to be aware of is that your monitor is a backlit, so your monitor is projecting light. A print is reflective, so it reflects light. It won't appear as bright as it will on your monitor. So you need to be prepared to understand that what you see on the screen is not 100% exactly what you'll get when it's printed out. There'll normally be somewhere between a 10 to 15% difference in how bright the image is. So it'll be between 10 and 15% darker when you get it printed. So you need to be aware of that when you're looking at it on your screen. If you don't have your screen calibrated, then obviously as well you need to figure out a way of making sure the colors are accurate. Now there's one way that you can do it yourself is that in your image you can look for a neutral tone. And if I come over here, so I'm just going to click on this eyedropper and go to RGB. So I look for a neutral tone. So this can be in the clouds, which say they may be meant to be gray. It can be, this might be kind of a neutral tone, or consider a close neutral tone here. So look at those and look then at the RGB values. So I'm just going to use my eyedropper tool. So I'm clicking on my eyedropper tool and hold the shift key. So I'm going to just put a point, drop a point here. And now that point is listed here. So my RGB values I see are 40, 43, 47. Now, if this was to be a neutral value, so that should be a neutral value with no particular color tint in it, the RGB values would all be the same. So if the RGB values are all the same, that means it's either a neutral black, a neutral gray, or a neutral white. So you could then adjust based on that. So if I was to do that, so you can use these values to check if your image has got, if it does or doesn't have a color cast on it. I'm just going to drag this away. Sometimes if you're color grading your image to have a specific look in terms of color, then of course that won't work for you. If you are color grading your images to have a specific color or specific look, then it might be a good idea that you have your monitor calibrated. So you can calibrate it using hardware devices. That is the most accurate way to calibrate it. The other option is if you don't have it calibrated, most professional print labs will allow you to get a test print of your work. So they'll take a strip of your work. So what I mean, a strip of they will crop out a strip of it. You can specify it in some cases if you wish to. And normally it's a small strip of the work, might be where some important tones are. So you want to grab an area where the highlights and the shadows and the midtones all are, and then they will print that for you. And then based on that, you can re-edit your image to make sure it has the specific look that you want it to in terms of color and lightness. But one quick way I find useful, so if I go to my levels, so I quite often find it quite useful to, if I drop this down 10%, I can kind of get an idea. So I'm just holding the shift key and the down arrow when I'm in this middle value here. So I hold shift and go down, and that brings me down about 10%. And that gives me an idea of how it will look when it's printed. If I think that's too dark, well, then I'm going to need to brighten it up a little bit for the print process. So I'm just going to delete that. So another things that you need to consider when you're getting your work printed is the medium that you're going to use. So the medium is with inkjet normally going to be paper. Within that, you're going to have different types of paper. So you might use a matte medium, which is a surface that's completely matte, where there's no shine or gloss off it. So in those cases, those types of images, you would need to, when you're adding sharpening at the end, when you've sized your image, you will need to add more sharpening. And you will also need to add a little bit more saturation to your image, because matte paper normally desaturates your image slightly. So it can be good to add about 10% more saturation if you're printing with matte paper. So why do you need to sharpen your image more? So one reason you need to sharpen your image more is something called dot gain. Okay, so dot gain essentially is when your image is getting printed, when the ink hits the medium, on a matte surface, it tends to soak the ink up more, and the dots of ink spread out more, and that's known as dot gain. So the dot gain is greater on matte paper, therefore it's a good idea to add more sharpening to the image. With glossy surfaces or these semi-gloss surfaces, you don't need to add as much sharpening because the dot gain is lower. So this is also something to keep in mind. Be aware that the type of paper you're going to get printed on affects how you're going to prepare your print as well. And, also think about the type of method. So some people, there are alternative methods that printers use. For instance, they can mount your print and case it in plexiglass. That can require you to prepare your digital file in a specific way. You might also get it framed, which means putting it behind glass. And that again may also affect how you're going to prepare your digital image. But you should check these things with your printer first, because they'll know best how to prepare the image for a particular process. So we go back here now. I want to talk for a little moment about image size and sizing your image and how to get the best possible quality for the size that you want to print at. If you're preparing an exhibition and you're hanging your images on a wall, you may have a specific idea of the size of the image you want. Depending on the type of work you're doing, it may be small, it may be big, but there are a couple of things that you should be aware of. So if we go up here to image and our image size dialog box, so you see this image here, it's from a 42 megapixel camera, so you can see it's about nearly 8,000 pixels in width by 5,300, which is a good significant size. And then you can see here by default our print resolution, because this was the setting in Adobe Camera Raw, is set to 300 pixels per inch. So that means for every 300 pixels, 1 inch of paper will be assigned to it. And yes, we use, even though I myself am in Europe, we still use the imperial system for this. You can look at pixels per centimeter, but even in the EU and Europe, it's not used. Pixels per inch is the one that's used, but we still will use the metric system when we talk about the image size, which can get a little bit confusing, but it's the way things that are done. So if we look in centimeters then, so an image printed at 300 pixels per inch for this resolution, which is, if you remember, this 7,952 by 5,304, will result in an image of 67.33 by 44.91, so nearly 45. So how does that get worked out? So we see I have my calculator here. So we can easily see how that gets worked out. So we have our first dimensions, the width, which is 7,952 pixels, and we just divide that by 300, and that will give us the size in inches. So that's about 26.5 inches. We'll change this for simplicity's sake. We'll change it to inches for the moment. So you can see here, yes, the size is, it matches here. So if we cancel that, and then we take our height, which was 5,304 pixels, and we divide that by 300. And then we see that that's 17.68, which is also here. So that allows us to see what our image is. You can see here resample is checked. So resampling means is a method of resizing your image where it creates new pixels or removes pixels from your image if you're reducing the image size, for instance. So for instance, I'm going to just uncheck resample here. So say I'm just going to go back to centimeters. So for instance, I want to print this image. I have a specific size in mind that I want to print it. So let's just try a few different ones. So 70, so 80. So say I want to print it at 1 meter by 66. You can see now automatically my resolution drops down because I'm not resampling. So it's assigning less pixels per inch of paper. So that then it's lowering that print resolution for us. If you want, you could also resample. Now, what resolutions are optimal for printing at? So normally the recommended print resolution is 300. So you'll hear printers tell you, okay, bring your files, prepare them in such and such a way, and the print resolution should be 300 pixels per inch. That's what they will recommend. You can, however, lower this number. So for instance, if I lowered it down to 200, what we had a moment ago, I've got 1 meter. So I'm printing now at a lower resolution. The image, when I print it, the image won't look as sharp. Sometimes it's preferable to print the image by lowering the PPI, so this number here, than it is to resample it. So for instance, if you don't have any upscaling software, that's specialized software for resampling, so a few types are kind of Alien Skin Blow Up, Topaz also have one as well. So if you don't have those, then you'll depend on the Photoshop engine and how good that sharpening software is. And personally, if I'm doing a small blow up, so for instance for this image where I'm changing it from 1 meter from what it was, so if we go back to 300, I'm changing it from, and I don't want to resample it, I'm changing it from 67 to a meter. I'm printing it at 200 ppi, or roughly around 200 ppi. Then I might go ahead and print it at that, because that may get me a good enough quality rather than resampling it. Sometimes when you resample an image, it can introduce artifacts into the image, because essentially it's using an algorithm to duplicate pixels. It looks at the pixels in the area and then it duplicates a pixel based on that. Now Photoshop has gotten better at doing that. It produces better results, but it's not perfect. So you need to decide what is the best way to do this. And from experience, the experience that I've had in print, I have found that quite often it can work out better to lower the resolution, but this can depend, it can vary from image to image. So sometimes what I would do is I might change the resolution and then I would print a small area of the image just to give it a test and see which looks better. Does it look better resampled, or does it with resampling, sorry, or does it look better with just printing it with a lower PPI? Now, how low can your PPI go, or how big can your image be is a question that we get a lot. The answer is it depends on what you're printing. So it depends on what the image looks like. If it's a portrait of a person or something where the detail needs to be sharp, and if you don't want it to look like a digital photograph, then the truth is you can't really blow it up that much. If you push the image too far, you will start getting artifacts and jagged edges, and it will look like a digital file. If you want to avoid that, then I would recommend shooting with larger formats or going to a camera that allows you to get more pixels. So normally, a camera with 40 megapixel resolution would normally be enough for printing at a reasonably big size, like for instance here, where it's a meter by more. If you want to go above that to like 1.5 meters, then I would recommend medium or large format. But you can, get perfectly good results from bigger files. This is if you want the image to be sharp and something is standing right next to it. So let's just I want to look at a formula, a way of determining your print size. The bigger your print is, the further someone will have to stand back from it. So if you've got a print that's a meter by 1.5 meters, you're going to have to stand back quite a long way to see it. Now again, because we use PPI and it's imperial, this formula does work off those imperial measurements. So if you're using, as we do in the EU here, if you're using centimeters, you'd have to just do a conversion between these when you're figuring this out. So in order to determine if your digital file, if you can blow it up to a specific size that you might be thinking about, this is a useful formula as a guideline. It's not a rule, but it's a good guideline. So first of all, we can figure out the viewing distance. So the viewing distance is the diagonal measurement of your print, so the measurement of the size that you want to print to, from the top left or right corner to the bottom right or left corner. So you're measuring the diagonal of the print. And then once you have that diagonal, so for instance here, let's see what we've got on the next page. So we've got 16 by 24, so we'll use this one. So the diagonal from one corner to the opposite corner is 43 inches for a 16 by 24 print. So your diagonal is 28.8, and then we multiply that by 1.4, so that gives us a viewing distance of, it gives us a diagonal measurement of 43 inches. So 43 inches then would be, it's roughly about 3.5 feet that you're standing back 3.5 feet from the print in order to be at the optimal viewing distance, to be able to see it all as you're standing there. So then we take that 43, and then in order to determine the lowest possible PPI that we can use for printing it, we take our viewing distance, which is 43, and we divide it into 3,438. And here you can see we have a lowest possible PPI that's required is 80. So in our case, with an image that has this particular resolution, 3888 by 2592, then if we are printing it by 16 inches by 24 inches, our actual PPI would actually be 162. So we have enough in it. 80 is quite low for printing. So while at 3.5 feet away, the image will look fine. If you want your image to be sharp when someone is standing next to it, 80 won't be enough, and certainly 162 might not be enough either, although you can print as low as 144 pixels per inch. But in this case, you may want to, for this particular image here, you may want to do some resampling as well as lowering the PPI. Now, if someone comes to us with a very small image that they've perhaps taken on a mobile phone and they want to load up to a large size, sometimes we will use a combination of decreasing the PPI and resampling the image. Because if we resample it to upscale it by a large amount, you will get jagged edges, you will get digital artifacts, and the image won't look good when it's printed out. So a combination of both can then help the image to look better when it's printed out. So that might be something that you need to think about when you're preparing your image for printing. One of the most important things to do when you're doing that is that you prepare it yourself as much as you can. Because if you hand it over to the printer, then it's out of your hands. And also you need to add sharpening once you've sized it. So then you're leaving it up to the printer to either add the sharpening or not add the sharpening for you. Most professional printers know what looks good in a photograph, so they should handle your photograph well. If you're not bringing it to a professional printer, so if you're taking it to a high street lab or some other type of lab that's not quite up to professional standards, but they do print, like camera shops sometimes will have printing facilities, but they won't necessarily check the prints for the quality. They'll just print out what you send them. So in those cases, it's quite important that you check everything yourself. Have your image at the correct size. Use the image size dialog box and have it sized correctly. So the size that you place here. So if I sent this image now to my printers, I would get back a print that's 1 meter by 66.7 centimeters. That's what I would get back, printed with this resolution. So once you size your image, so I'm sizing my image now, I'm leaving it like this, this is the size I want it, you need then to add sharpening to your image. So you want to sharpen it in the best possible way. There's a number of different ways that you can sharpen it in Photoshop. I've talked about sharpening before, I have another video on it, so I'll just go briefly into it here, but I'll put a link to the video below on sharpening. So the next thing then you need to do is, so normally if I'm going to use unsharp mask, of course I'm going to convert for smart filters. I'm going to zoom in 100% because I want to see what the image looks like at 100% when it's sharpened. I go to sharpen and I go to my unsharp mask. You can also use, there are other sharpen tools in Photoshop these days. For instance, Smart Sharpen and so on. So you can also use these to sharpen your image. So it's just when you're sharpening your image, you need to sharpen it so it's sharper, but not noticeable that you sharpened it. So if I click, so for this image, it's subtle, but it's sharp enough. So that's okay, I had my sharpening. So I'm just going to combine those changes with the image. So now if I'm preparing to send this image to the printer, check with your printer what format you need to send it in. So it may be fine to send it in a TIFF format. Some printers, for instance, if you're bringing it to a high street printing lab or a camera shop, they may require it in a JPEG format. So you just need to check with them. You can also check with them what bit depth you should supply it in. So for instance, I work with the professional printers and we're using high-end inkjet printers that can print a very wide gamut. and tonal range. So we tell our customers that they can send our files as TIFF files in 16 bits. So we go to the mode, they can send it in 16 bits per channel, and they can send it with the ProPhoto color profile attached. So they can send it that way for printing to us, because the printers that we use can manage that wider color gamut. You may need to change that then based on your own printer. If they instruct you that in some cases you need to send it in 8-bit mode, you can come here, change this to 8-bit mode, and then come down to edit, convert to profile. They might specify that you need to send it in Adobe RGB 1998, for instance. This is a common printing color profile. So it's a good idea to convert it yourself, just in case you may not, and you probably won't see any color shifts on the screen, because the color space of a screen is normally smaller than the color space of a printer. So you don't see color shifts when you're converting from ProPhoto to Adobe RGB, for instance. But now I've converted it to Adobe RGB. You can see here that at the bottom. And then I would go ahead and save my file as a JPEG file. That's all the information about preparing your file for printing, what needs to be done, how to size the image, and how to determine how big you can print your particular image. In regards to just printing your image, let me just finish up by saying that the content of the image will, of course, depend on how big you can print it. So for images where there's a lot of sharp detail, you obviously are going to be restricted that the larger it gets, the less sharp that detail will be. For more abstract photographs, of course, you could print bigger, because maybe it doesn't matter how sharp the image is going to be. It will also depend, again, this comes back to the medium that you get it printed on. We have found that if you're printing on, for instance, matte paper, so a non-glossy paper, you can squeeze a little bit more and get your image printed a little bit bigger. For glossy papers, any defects in the image, digital artifacts, you notice them straight away. They'll be very obvious straight away. So we recommend it for that your image looks really neat and good with no jagged edges or artifacts for printing on glossy or semi-gloss media. Okay, so I hope this was useful. If you like the content, you can subscribe to the channel. If you have any questions, you can put them in the comments below, and I'll try and answer any questions you have about printing. Thank you for watching.